Then good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to introduce Professor Benjamin Sovacool, our keynote speaker, who is going to talk about decarbonization and low carbon transitions from a critical justice perspective. Unfortunately, and because the COVID restrictions, Professor Sovacool cannot be here with us, but he will intervene, as you can see, online. Dr. Benjamin Sovacool is Professor of Energy Policy and the Director of the Sussex Energy Group in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. As all of you know, the CV of Professor Sovacool is really impressive, not only because the number of works, but also because his works have been really influential and opened new views in the fields of energy policy and politics, energy security, energy justice, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. Let me highlight briefly some details of his CV. Professor Sovacool is the author of more than 300 referred articles, book chapters, and reports, and the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 18 books on energy and climate change topics. He has also presented his research on more than 120 international conferences in 48 countries, and he is the founding editor-in-chief for the international journal Energy Research and Social Science. He has received many international awards and honors, including the 2019 Universal Scientific Education and Research Network Prize for his work on social justice in an era of climate change and energy scarcity. Professor Sovacool is a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report, and he is also advisor on energy to the European Commission. As I said before, the work of Professor Sovacool has been really influential, and he is one of the most highly cited researchers regarding energy and climate policy issues. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sovacool, for accepting our invitation, for being here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I really wish I could be there in Spain in person. So today's talk is going to be a bit different. As you can see in the title, it's about decarbonization, which everyone seems to want and which we need as a society because we have to cut emissions as soon as we can. But it's also then about discontents, who loses, who might be upset or who might oppose or even suffer when we actually do decarbonization processes. I think it's important to start kind of by just briefly reminding everyone here. I know it's very nice in Barcelona, but in other parts of the world, there are some pretty extreme examples of injustices associated with energy, whether it's things like child mining for coal in India, which is done to keep prices affordable for other Indian households, or the exportation of petrol-fueled cars that leave Europe as we adopt electric vehicles. These cars then go to Eastern Europe or here in sub-Saharan Africa. So we don't eliminate carbon-intensive transport, we just redistribute it. Or here that people in Europe, a bit closer to Spain, in Belarus and the Ukraine, are still suffering the unfair impacts of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which happened in 1986. These are thyroid cancer victims who are still suffering many of the health impacts even into this next decade. And finally, we even have injustices in very industrialized countries. This is from Mexico, where we've actually found extreme unevenness in terms of slums and the connections that people have with their livelihoods. This actually shows you a sweatshop where they pay about 70% of their income on energy services. And this also shows you gypsies and travelers in Northern Ireland, who also face extreme energy burdens relating to mobility and to transport. And what we see is as we start to adopt new innovations, in this study, we looked at mobility innovations, so things like electric vehicles and bike sharing and ride hailing and automated cars. These aren't adopted uniformly. There are huge disparities in how they're adopted. You can see here, they tend to be adopted by people who have more wealth, or men, or who are middle age, or who don't necessarily have large families and have a lot of disposable income that they can use. We also see inequity. This is a 2022 study that we've just published that tracks 4 cutting edge innovations. We have electric vehicles, we have improved cook stoves, we have food sharing, and we also have solar, household solar panels. And you can see that they perpetuate inequity across demographic groups, across spatial regions, across different species, and even across generations, where they impose burdens on future generations without their consent, of course. So this has really provoked us to harness in on what we call energy justice. An energy justice approach reminds us that energy isn't just about technology and economics. It really forces us to grapple with how we disseminate the costs of energy, how fairly we also access the benefits, things like ownership, patents, things like fair policymaking and procedures. This gets into the governance implications. And finally, things like recognition or support for the poor and the vulnerable. And as you can imagine, this perspective gives you a very messy, if you would like an unkind term, or very comprehensive and interconnected, if you would like a kinder term, perspective on energy. It sits at the nexus of what we would normally see of sustainability foci on carbon, and availability foci on security of supply, and accessibility foci on poverty. And it also sits at the interstitials between environmental sciences and political science and economics and law, policy, regulation. But it is a heuristic, a kaleidoscopic heuristic that brings multiple dimensions of energy into sharper focus. The way energy justice research has generally been applied in the field is two ways. The first way here, kind of proposed by Kirsten Jenkins and colleagues, is called the tenets approach. This takes different tenets of justice you see on the left hand. So distributional justice, recognitional justice, procedural justice, or notions of human rights and cosmopolitanism. And it applies them to both describe energy issues and also prescribe solutions. So it really bridges that evaluative normative divide. And in our own research, we've taken that framework and applied it to things like Nordic electric mobility. And you can see each tenet of justice brings a dimension of injustice into focus. The other way that people have applied energy justice work is the principles of justice. And here we hypothesized in some earlier work 10 principles. All of them are considered equal. There's no hierarchy. You need all of them. And as you can see, or you can intuit, as you start to try to meet more principles, it gets more difficult to meet energy justice goals. It might be fairly easy to identify a policy or a program or a transition or a technology that meets one or two, like availability or affordability. But as you try to meet many, many more different types of equity, different types of responsibility, different types of resistance, it becomes extremely difficult, which shows you how hard it is to actually perpetuate and promote energy justice work. You can also see in our work how we haven't always applied all of the principles. This just shows you a study a few years ago in the UK, where we took 4 different innovations: energy service contracts, battery electric vehicles, household solar photovoltaic panels, and low carbon heat, mostly retrofits, and showed in each case, taking 4 justice principles, how in some cases they improve the principles, but in other cases they actually erode the principles, and there's no innovation that has a purely positive impact. They create a nest of wicked types of injustices. In newer work, we've kind of hypothesized that the energy justice community should pursue some new frontiers. We talked about 6 of them in this review article. Things like different theoretical frameworks, things like moving beyond humans, things like looking at cross-scalar issues, looking at the co-benefits of justice, or some of the winners and losers, or how to deconstruct energy justice as a discourse. And our Innopaths work, this was a Horizon 2020 grant, which just ended, was explicitly designed to focus on 2 of these. We really wanted to look at number 3, so cross-scalar, whole systems issues of justice, and number 5, the political economy, or the winners and losers of justice when you try to do things like decarbonization and low carbon transition. So all of this work focuses on both suggestion 3 and 5. As a starting point for that, we were very inspired by this work with Noel Healy, Jenny Stevens, and Stephanie Malin, where they talked about how when you look not necessarily at just a coal plant, but if you look across the entire fuel cycle for coal extraction and mining, coal processing, coal transport, coal storage, and disposal, you start to see the hidden injustices, the sacrifice zones that fossil fuels create, which become embodied into the supply chain. And these can be quite significant, like slow violence or human rights abuses or environmental pollution from processing or uneven livelihood disruption on transport or very hazardous risks from things like waste. And Healy et al. Were kind of saying it's kind of a shame that our environmental impact assessments only look at coal power at the power plant. They only look at the site of combustion. And in focusing there on that square, they miss all these other hidden layers. And we read Healy et al. And we were very inspired. We said, my gosh, we understand that these sacrifice zones exist for fossil fuels. But what about pro-climate interventions? Do they also exist for solar energy or nuclear power or things like wind farms or energy efficiency? And so we embarked on a program where we looked at 4 very big European energy transitions. Nuclear power in France, household solar energy in Germany, battery electric vehicles in Norway, and smart meters in Great Britain. It gets you 2 demand side technologies, nuclear and solar, and 2 demand side technologies, electric vehicles and smart meters. And all 4 transitions are very, very large. France is the world's largest exporter of nuclear power. They get about 3/4 of their electricity from nuclear. Germany has the highest per capita rates of solar PV adoption in the world. Norway is the undisputed king of electric vehicle adoption. 70% of new car sales there are EVs. And in Great Britain, they're hoping to install 56 million smart meters by the end of 2024 for electricity and natural gas, calling the UK government to term the smart meter rollout the infrastructural challenge of this generation. We embarked on an original data collection process because there weren't existing data sets to kind of tell us about the injustices. And so we conducted 64 expert interviews with some very important stakeholders in the process, including the Atomic Energy Commission, or EDF in France, or the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Germany, or the Ministry of Transport in Norway, or the Ministry Department for Business and Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. Because we didn't want to constrain ourselves to only asking experts, we also did 5 focus groups. And because a lot of these interviews were in the capital cities of Paris and Berlin and Oslo and London, we made sure that our focus groups were not in those areas, and we picked more rural or peri-rural locations. And because only a few dozen people could attend the focus groups, we lastly had a final method of going to the internet where people can be more comfortable at articulating injustices. And we joined internet forums that had more than 2 million members, and we repeated our interview methodology there. I should tell you that although I think this research design has a lot of strengths, it's mixed methods, there's lots of triangulation, it's original data, we still had more input from the experts. In this work I'm presenting, we don't talk about the injustices of not doing the transitions. So we're only one-sided. We're only telling you about the injustices of the transition. We also have this article at the bottom here that did talk about co-benefits. So you can look there later for more balance. That talks about all of the kind of health and environmental, social, technical reasons to do the transitions. And finally, we didn't correct respondents. We didn't, we took a very ethnographic, neutral approach. So that means that our respondents may have been wrong. If they have misperceptions of the transition, we took it at face value. They were experts, most of them. What we did then is we conducted these frequency counts that give you a laundry list, a very depressing laundry list of the injustices. This shows you, and we use the tenets approach. So this shows you distributive injustices for French nuclear power, and we've ordered them in order of frequency. So this kind of gives you a sense for what came up a lot, what came up a little, what maybe only came up a few times. On the right, you can see supported by. RI is research interview, FG is focus group, IF is internet forum, and we ordered them from most frequent to least frequent. So we get you a sense of like what are the most prominent recurring injustices identified. So anytime you have high frequency or support across all three methods, it's very rigorous because it's independent triangulation. Obviously, you can see in this slide 5 injustices with French nuclear power. But how many did we find in total? We were blown away that we found 120. 120 distinct injustices across the transitions. Most of them were dominated by distributive concerns, but recognition concerns, which is very troubling because it's extremely vulnerable groups like disabled people or the homeless or women or children, were second. Cosmopolitan concerns like global externalities were third, and procedural issues of fairness and policymaking and governance were fourth at only 13 injustices. Interestingly, they were also fairly evenly distributed across the transitions. It wasn't like nuclear power had 80 and solar panels had 3. It is interesting that smart meters had slightly more injustices than nuclear power, but that could be cultural, could be British respondents like to complain more than French respondents. It could be that smart meters are more intrusive at going into the home. And it could also be that French nuclear power, there's kind of a culture of not always criticizing the government, where people feel more comfortable to speak out in the United Kingdom. What we then did is we mapped those injustices, 120 injustices, across these different dimensions to create a whole systems approach. This is very much like what Noel Healy did. And so you can see we have a matrix of different scales: injustices at the neighborhood scale, community scale, injustices at the national scale, injustices at the global scale, as well as across different phases of the transition, like production and manufacturing and mineral extraction, or consumption and use and policymaking, or things like disposal and waste and the afterlives of the technology. And you get a very depressing matrix that catalogs all of the different dimensions of injustice. And if you just take this top row that says macro scale and global, you can actually map the injustices here. And this is amazing. Remember, these are the injustices for European transitions, and they're low carbon transitions. And everywhere in red is where our data pointed to a transition really far away outside of the country. So there are globally circulating injustices as far away as the interruption of tar sands viability in Canada, or the dependence on lithium mines, which have very negative impacts on water in South America, or cobalt mining in Africa, or interference with liquefied natural gas in Australia, or reliance on poor labor practices and maybe human rights abuses of Uyghurs in China, or interruption of profits for Gazprom, Russia, as it's trying to supply more gas into Europe. So it really underscores the multi-scalar nature of transitions and how they can affect the globe, even with transitions limited to a national context. One of the other things we found, which was quite troubling, is that many of these impacts, sticking with recognitional justice concerns, often befall the most vulnerable groups, whether it is scrapyard workers and children handling electronic waste, or people working in artisanal mines for copper, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, or winemakers, which we'll talk about in a moment, or even modern forms of slavery, where we dispossess people and even entrap them in bondage and different forms of servitude, or women and children, or precarious workers and unions. So we're not benefiting people. We're targeting sometimes very, very vulnerable groups that have very low levels of resilience. With that in mind, because the first part of the study is very macro, right? We gave you the map of global injustices. We gave you the laundry list of 120 injustices, but we didn't tell you which ones were the most severe, right? Some of them deal with death and species destruction and ecocide, and others just do things like traffic jams or people feeling anxious that a smart meter is getting installed. So we wanted to do a second phase of the research that talked more about the human impacts. And rather than taking a laundry list approach, we took a community-based approach where we spent time with 4 specific communities, 1 for each of the transitions. And part of the reason is because you see here in this very, very extensive review, which we published last year, this is a review, 20 years of work, 332 case studies tracking climate mitigation. So renewables, efficiency, better agriculture, better land use, biofuel. And you can see in many of the cases, local communities, host communities, lose out themselves, and 76.8%, the people hosting the technology get hurt. And you can also see a long list here of farmers, pastoralists, fishers, women, even prostitutes who will follow hydroelectric megaprojects, or the mafia, who have been connected to wind farm deployment in Italy, are actually implicated on this list. It's also very, very salient that we see a long list of indigenous people and ethnic communities that are at risk from climate change efforts all around the world, many of them under threat from multiple transitions. Look at the Mapuche in Chile, or look at the kind of African Americans in Michigan, or other communities in Brazil. And here's the really sad thing. This is just the first part of the table. We identified almost 70 specific ethnic communities, First Nations groups, or indigenous peoples at risk of being hurt or marginalized by transitions. That goes on and on. This shows you more in Canada and Mexico and Papua New Guinea and Nepal and Malaysia and Canada, and on into Ghana and the Congo and India and Senegal and Argentina, and places like Peru. So that's why we really wanted to capture the lived experiences of injustice, and we chose 4 communities to visit. We visited French wineries who are being displaced by nuclear power plants. We visited solar workers in Germany who have been unemployed. Hundreds of thousands of them have actually been unemployed due to the boom and bust cycles there. We visited scrapyards in Ghana, which is where 70% of electronic waste from the UK goes, including smart meters and batteries and in-home displays. And we visited Congolese cobalt mines in sub-Saharan Africa, which are a vital component for electric vehicle batteries. And sticking with our mixed methods research design, we did expert interviews to set the context. We then did community interviews with the solar workers, with mayors, with wine growers, with scrapyard workers, with artisanal miners, industrial miners, members of the mining police and the mining unions. And we did an immense amount of embedded field research, including multiple vineyards and winemaking fairs in France, my poor research fellow there, solar manufacturing sites across Eastern Germany, 20 different scrapyards in Ghana, and 30 different parts of the supply chain for mines in the Congo, including cobalt processing centers, trading depots, industrial mines, and artisanal mines. And we found that the lived experiences of these transitions are stark and negative. So this shows you just how close some of the nuclear infrastructure in the Rhone Valley get to vineyards. And some vineyards like this one have lost 40% of their sales every time there's an alleged incident or concern at the Trisketon nuclear power facility. These wineries are struggling to survive because they have to sit adjacent to nuclear power plants, which can pollute the water, change the microclimate, and also change thermal deltas because they have so much heat, which can actually cause lots of the vines to wither and die. Or in Germany, where we've seen more than 100,000 workers lose their jobs, and the complete collapse of communities where they were making solar panels, which means loss of pensions, loss of jobs, loss of cooperatives, loss of tax revenue, and very high rates of unemployment that have seen local municipalities basically collapse. This actually shows you the solar park where they used to make the world's largest amount of solar photovoltaic cells. This was Q cells before they were merged and downsized by a Chinese conglomerate. So it's leaving degraded communities in its wake. And this shows you just how toxic the open burning of electronic waste is in Ghana, where life expectancy for people living here, and they drink that water and they eat food here, is close to only 40 years of age. So almost half the life expectancy of a normal human being, because of their toxic exposure to pollutants in their supply, in their food supply and their water supply and their air. And quite troublingly, community toxicity is higher than toxicity for workers because the community lives there, but the workers get to go home at night. So it's another example of displacing that pollution and its toxic impacts to to people who aren't even involved directly in benefiting from the scrapyard processing. And finally, this shows you a young artisanal miner in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He is so poor, he's literally mining cobalt with his hands. You can see he has flip-flops at the bottom there. He has no shoes. He has no shovel. He has no ladder. He has no ventilation, no adequate structural support, and no on-site medical care should an accident happen. All he has is his headlamp and his hands. What this means, and we've tracked it here, is that we should pursue, while we don't think you should abandon the transitions in question, you should pursue better policy efforts to make them more just. And just like the injustices cascade around the world across those different life cycles, this is a multi-scalar approach. We think the policy mechanisms should also target each of these phases. We've got to come to grips with better policies for the extractive industry sector, like adherence to better principles of labor protection and occupational and health guidelines. We definitely need to do a better job at ensuring better planning and stronger social and environmental impact assessments or the sharing of benefits. We definitely need to promote better ownership models and compensate people who are disrupted from the transition. This is about a just transition. And finally, we have to come to grips with better supply chain management, better care of waste, and fining those who violate the rules so flagrantly, especially in places like scrapyards and artisanal mines. And that's the kind of rub, is that you don't have to abandon these transitions. We've mapped in our literature review, as well as our expert interviews, immediate policy responses that actors could take, local government, communities, national government, civil society, that could make lives better for these communities this week. So there are a whole array of things we could do today to help make these transitions more equitable, which is why you don't have to abandon them. You just need to better account for the ways in which they can perpetuate inequality, unfairness, and pollution. So what does this mean, to kind of come back to the beginning of the talk? I think, first of all, I really hope our Innopaths work does bring to light kind of why energy justice matters. Like, energy justice is not the same as climate justice. It's not the same as environmental justice. It is a distinct conceptual tool that has been used to integrate different strands of justice thinking. So it's a way of offering you a device that allows you to talk about distributive issues, procedural issues, human rights issues, and recognitional vulnerability issues all together. And that is a nice contrast to studies that might only have talked about distributive injustices or recognitional justices, period. I think the second thing it does, especially for engineers, those of you that aren't social scientists, is it's a good analytical tool that helps underscore the socio-technical nature of energy transitions. It shows you how values, politics, culture, norms, beliefs, irrational actions, corruption, all get blended into our transitions. There's no such thing as a purely technical transition. And the third thing it does is it offers a good decision-making tool that all of us can use to make more informed decisions, especially those principles of energy justice. When you're thinking about what political party to endorse, what policy to support, where your pension will invest, what type of a technology you will adopt, what type of career you will pursue, where you will donate your time if you ever volunteer, all of that can be informed by our principles. Choose institutions and policies and programs that promote fairness, equity, accountability, responsibility, etc., and actively resist those that do not. I think it's also quite true that, unfortunately, an energy justice lens reveals some of the downsides to these European transitions that so many of us want to replicate. It shows that these transitions, even in Europe, which is known as having very good governance, the European Commission, very, very good technology, even here, you can see that these transitions are perpetuating toxic pollution, exploitation of labor, unfair gender rules, ethnic discrimination, destruction of the environment, and very unjust outcomes for very vulnerable groups. And I think it's really interesting, too, that these types of injustices are not only related to fossil fuels, and they're not only dominated by big technology supply, like nuclear power. We also see it in our research with these decentralized, democratic, digitalized options like smart meters or electric vehicles or energy visualization in home displays and batteries and storage. And it's ironic that some of these are used to fight fuel poverty here in Europe while they exacerbate poverty in other parts of the world. The third point is that these transitions remind us that justice isn't about just the technology. All of these procedural issues are really about policy. It's not only the transitions, but the way in which they were shaped by policy incentives, the way in which Norway promoted automobiles through their incentives, but not other forms of e-mobility like scooters, right, or e-bikes. Or it's the way that the smart meter rollout was led by suppliers, of which there are 80 suppliers in the UK. And if you switch suppliers, the smart meters stop working, but 4 million homes switch suppliers a year. So again, that's poor policy design. There's maybe nothing wrong with smart meters per se. It's just the way in which policy tried to implement and shape their actually diffusion. And if you think back to the final part of my talk, you also that the procedural and policy elements point us to transformative leverage points that we can harness to make the technologies more equitable and just. These injustices are not inevitable. We can craft policy architecture today that makes them more just and accountable. Also, that map that showed you those kind of global injustices reminds us that these impacts remain multi-scalar. For nuclear power, I talked about some of these. I didn't talk more, I could have, about things like uranium mining. France gets most of its uranium from places like Niger, Kazakhstan, Australia, and Canada. Those uranium mines also impose lots of burdens on indigenous groups and communities. I also could have talked about nuclear waste and the risk of things like nuclear weapons proliferation. Those are all global issues. I talked a little bit about low-wage manufacturing for solar in China, human rights abuses. I didn't talk so much about the factory waste streams that are in the solar supply chain. I talked a little bit about things like electronic waste for smart meters. I didn't talk so much about how they also need copper and cobalt and other minerals and rare earths. And I talked a little bit about things like extractive industries for EVs, but I didn't talk about how they're also contributing to e-waste, or a little bit the cheaper, dirtier cars that leave the Nordic region and flood other markets. So again, these all remind us that European transitions are not only European. And I'm very concerned. I'm a big advocate of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think clean energy is a human right, but how we currently secure it forces too many trade-offs with other human rights. And you can call this green on green conflict, one environmental group against another, or poor on poor conflict. One group of poor benefits, another group of poor loses. And I think what we must do going forward is avoid this mistake that Healy et al. Say you should avoid, and that we say you should avoid, by only focusing on where technologies are used. We also need to now account for these multi-scalar issues. Otherwise, we will create what we've called a decarbonization divide that sees one part of the world get decarbonized, but only at the expense of another. And with that, I'm very happy to open it up for questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for this excellent presentation. A lot of questions, debates. We have time for some questions, at least 5-7 minutes. There is any question from the participants? Elisenda, please, and after that, Francois.
First, thank you very much for this fantastic talk, really very interesting. And I have just one short question. How do you compare one injustice to another one and try to evaluate? How do you difference an injustice with, for instance, inconvenience or a cost? And the other one is, if I am wondering if you have tried to also analyze and quantify the effect of this injustice. And that's the two short questions.
Very good question. So To the second, no, we've not tried to quantify them because a lot of our methods are qualitative, and this was all qualitative work. So we'd be happy to have people quantify them, and maybe you could with willingness to pay or other sorts of metrics, but we don't. We never tried to do that. To the first part, it's very, very true that a lot of our injustices could also be seen as just an impact, an inconvenience, an externality. The key to us is we didn't ask that question. The question we asked was, tell us about the injustices for the transition. So at least in that way, everything we presented was considered by our respondents to be an injustice. And we didn't correct that, given that we wanted to subscribe to this notion of recognition, which says that everyone's concerns are valid. And if someone says it's an injustice to them, who were we to say that it's not? But it does mean that that list of injustices ranges in severity. Some of them are life-threatening and irreversible. Others are very, very minor and probably not true injustices. And so, yeah, we didn't take an evaluation of that, but we think that at least we hedged it a little bit because we asked about injustices in the question. We didn't ask about impacts or inconveniences.
Francois, please.
Yeah, just a quick question, a bit to be the devil's advocate, maybe. To the extent to which, these things, these injustices in the green transition may be intertwined, which is what you're arguing, or like separable because the injustices are already there. So now there is the energy transition and it's happening in an unjust world, but in fact, maybe not causing a net addition in injustices because it is replacing even more unjust industries.
No, that is an excellent point. And I think it is one that, so I've got two quick answers. The first is that in our work at the end in the decarbonization divide paper, we take a step back and we kind of say, in some of the transitions, like Congolese cobalt mining or electronic waste in Ghana, those things existed far before the transitions. So this is a case of where the transitions didn't create an injustice. Those were structurally there, but the transitions made them worse. So they take something wrong and they accelerate it. However, in other situations, most likely French wineries and German solar workers, the transitions themselves created new injustices, new invulnerabilities that weren't there before. And I think that's quite helpful. It kind of shows, well, in some cases, they can perpetuate what's already there, but in other cases, they can create new injustices. The final thing I wanted to say is that we've done very recent work looking at energy justice in Estonia. We just published a piece in Political Geography last month. And there in Estonia, we were looking at how they might phase out of oil shale. We identified 3 very different types of injustice. You have the injustices of doing nothing. That's the status quo. That's the injustice of emissions, the injustice of pollution, the injustice of not diversifying the economy. You have the injustice of phasing out. So as you phase out of oil shale, you have jobs lost, communities disrupted, national pride and competitiveness weakened. And then you have the injustices of phasing in, which would be the injustices of wind, land use, or solar, etc. So it kind of means like injustice abounds with whatever you do. And I think that's the problem. And what we found in Estonia is that while you have those 3 sets of injustices, the people in one transition will point to the other 2 and point out their injustices. So everyone is telling you about the injustices except with their own approach. And I think that only reveals the political economy of justice, that when you start looking for injustices, you'll find them everywhere.
Okay. Any more question? Last one? No? Yes, Ronald, short, please. We are just finishing. And last question, Benjamin, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. You ended with policy recommendations or easy policy recommendations that were being noted, but you did not mention NGOs. Have you inventorized whether NGOs recognize these issues and whether they respond to this?
No, very good point. If you look into the details of some of the policy stuff, there are civil society initiatives, so like civil society groups that track e-waste, civil society groups that are tracking things like transparency or traceability in supply chains. Those can certainly help. I think that paper was mostly geared towards national policy making, but there are certainly other dimensions of policy that industry can take. So there's one industry coalitions, the mining companies. There's also better ESG programs they could do. And then, yes, civil society groups at the local level, like miners' civil societies in the Congo, are very intimately involved with training the miners. So I think you're absolutely right. I didn't mean the presentation focused only on policy at the national scale, but I think that civil society is just as important, and we've got some recommendations for them too.
Okay, thank you very much again, Professor Sovacool, for this excellent presentation. I think we can finish this session here. Thank you. And then let me only some closing words to finish the symposium. First, again, also thank you very much for this excellent presentation for Professor Sovacool. With this, we are closing our symposium. And then as we come to the end of this day of stimulating contributions and debate, I just want to say some farewell words also on behalf of Professor Maria Teresa Costa. Thank you to everyone who has been here and also who has been online with us today, especially to the keynote speakers, all the presenters and the chairs, Elisa Trujillo, Paulina Beato, and Andreas Loschel. Thank you very much for your contributions. I would also like to thank all the participants for the quality of the debate and the questions. And as it's usual in these closing words, we would like to remind you that we are going to contact a high-impact journal in order to publish or to try to publish a special issue or section of the papers presented today. We will send more details to the speakers by email. The last year's papers are currently in revision in energy policy. We would like to thank also the scientific committee for its excellent work evaluating and selecting papers, and thank you also to the organizing committee. Many thanks to Joan Batalla for his support as director of FUNSEAM. Thank you very much also to the director of IB, Professor Durante, and to Martí Parellada, president of IB. Thank you very much to the research group of the Chair of Energy Sustainability for their dedication to this project, to Elisa Trujillo, François Cohen, and Daniel Davy, and also to the PhD students, Olivia McTighe, Jordi Planellas, Juan Ducal, and also Osman Hakan. And very, very special thanks to our project manager and also researcher, Elisenda Llobet. Her work, as all of you know, has been, or not, has been crucial, really crucial for the success of this symposium. Very special thanks to Elisenda. Finally, this symposium has required the efforts of many people who have worked on the institutional and logistic aspects of the events. I would like to thank Susana and Maria Angels from the IB, who take care of every detail. Thank you also to Deborah, Maite, and to the administrative team of FUNSEAM, and thank you also to the UB for its support. And that's all. Please, as you know now, we have a guide tour in this, to know better this very nice building. The guide tour will begin at 4:15, okay? And then we can remain here or outside, and then we'll have this guide tour. Then we hope to see you in person next year.